for the new semester. So it's the first talk of spring 2025. So thanks for coming. We have a busy week next week. On Tuesday, Simon Dedeo from CMU will be talking about hard proofs and good reasons. So the notion of proofs in science. I'm quite curious, knowing Simon, I'm quite curious what the talk will be about. But I highly recommend it. And on Friday, Lisa James, our postdoc, will be giving a new talk called An Apology for Platonism. So you're all welcome to that, to these two talks. And the first lecture in the annual lecture series will be on the 31st of January at 3:30 by Maureen Lichfeld, who will be talking about risk-benefit analysis in public health. Whose risk, whose benefit? All right. Now, to introduce the speaker, so I'm your speaker today, and many of you know me. Like on the center, you don't know me. All right. Without further ado, some of you have already heard some of the materials of these talks because I had distributed a few years ago a paper to the HBS community. So there will be some overlap, but I promise there will be some new things as well. It's also a prolegomenon, that's the technical word. The next book I plan to be writing now that I'm done with my current project. It's still very much speculative, so I'm actually it's going to end up with some very speculative ideas about why neuroscientists talk about representations. And so it'll be hand-wavy, but it's intentionally hand-wavy in order to, in a sense, start suggesting ideas, or putting a line of reflection. All right. I think it's without doubt that in neuroscience, neuroscientists often talk about representations when they describe what the brain does, not only to describe perception, to talk about visual representation, auditory representation, but also to describe cognition or motor action. So it's actually very common in much of neuroscience that the brain is described in representational terms. States of the brain are meant to be representational. But there's been a debate for now years in neuroscience and also in the philosophy of neuroscience as to whether it is the right thing to do, as to whether it is the right thing to describe the states of the brain as being representations. It ties to an older debate in the philosophy of cognitive science, a decades-long debate about whether it makes sense to describe the mind as forming representations of the world outside and as transforming representations during thinking. It's a very long debate, but today we'll be mostly be focused on the brain, on neuroscience. So I will be leading to psychology towards the end of the talk, but my interest in this new project is about neural representation, about whether we should think of brain states as representations, or what's the point of doing that. Now, what I will be arguing, and what I've already argued in print, is that the concept of neuroscience, the concept of representation in neuroscience is both unclear and confused. And in precise terms, I will explain what I mean when I say the concept is unclear, and what I mean when I say the concept is confused. I will argue that while many people might think it raises a challenge for the use of that concept, that's actually a problem for a concept of representation to be unclear and confused, that its lack of clarity and its confusion might in fact be functional, might in fact play a useful role for the development of neuroscience. And if that's true, the next question is, what role could it be? Why does a scientific concept, like the concept of representation, widely used in neuroscience, have these strange features to be unclear and to be obscure? And I think what I want to be doing in this new project is move the discussion away from a question about what are representations, which is what most philosophers have been interested in, to how is a concept of representation used in neuroscience. And once we get a sense of that, we can understand why the concept of representation has the properties that it happens to have in neuroscientific discourse. So that's a switch in the way philosophers of neuroscience have been trying to theorize about representations, away from a theory of representation toward a theory of the concept of representation. All right. So here is the structure of the talk. I'll say a few words about what I call mainstream representationalism, and then I'll present 4 empirical studies that some of you have already seen in the past. but I trust you've all forgotten about it, so I'm not too worried about that. And then, based on the results, I will be led to raise the question what to do with the concept of representation in neuroscience. And then I will think about possible things we could do and suggest what I think we should be doing to understand the function of this concept. All right, let's start with mainstream representationalism, which I also call neurorepresentationalism. And it's a very simple idea. If your goal is to understand what the brain does, for example, when we are thinking, when we are acting, when we are perceiving, you must be postulating representations. You must identify some brain states with representations. And that's a view that's very commonly held in neuroscience. I will give you some evidence that many neuroscientists believe in representationalism so characterized. But also, if you just look at neuroscience, you can actually find evidence throughout that working neuroscientists really believe that a good explanation of what the brain does requires postulating representations. I will give you some evidence right now that's widely accepted by just giving you a few quotations. But also more interesting, I think, rather than the quotation that people are making, is the fact that some methods in neuroscience are explicitly meant to identify neural representations. Their very function is to find out where in the brain representations of something is. And some research programs are also explicitly formulated in terms of representation. So let's start with widely accepted. Here are just a few quotations. I will not read them for you. I will just mention some of the people who have written. They're all very famous neuroscientists. Russ Poldrack, for example, says in a paper published in Synthèse, so in a philosophy journal, interestingly, very famous neuroscientist, the concept of representation is used broadly and uncontroversially throughout neuroscience. Freud, in Strange and Cognitive Sciences, says pretty much the same things, that you couldn't do neuroscience without the notion of representations. And Klicker-Scotter, also a very famous neuroscientist, pretty much says the same thing. So you have all these famous neuroscientists that just commit themselves to the idea that an explanation of what the brain does has to be formulated in terms of representation. More interesting, I think, is the fact that some of the most interesting methods developed in neuroscience over the last 25 years now are explicitly meant to identify representations in the brain. And I will describe 3 methods because they're sort of a puzzle for a philosopher. One which is called ephemeral adaptation, multivariate pattern analysis, and representational similarity analysis. I will describe them very briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on that. The first one, ephemeral adaptation, was developed in the late 1990s, early 2000s. The idea is quite simple. You present a stimulus and you measure the change in the ball, so the activation of the brain, one might say. And then you present another stimulus. And if it belongs to the same type, then the second activation will be decreased. If it belongs to another type, there won't be any decrease in activation. So you present 2 letters and you see a decrease in activation somewhere in the ventral stream. Then you say, oh, that part of the brain represents letters, because presenting 2 letters, when you see a second letter, it decreases the ball signal. If you present a letter and a numeral, you will not see that decrease in that part of the brain. Very simple concept. It's been widely used for about a decade in neuroscience to study the representations of letters, the representation of numbers, not numerals, but numbers, when numbers are represented, the representation of faces, and also things even as weird as the representation of virtues. So where in the brain do we think, like the concept of courage, for example, is located? Okay, that's one method. It had a 10-year span. It sort of disappeared from neuroscience. You rarely see paper using that method nowadays. Another method developed roughly at the same time, and the neuroscientist Hashby was quite influential, is called multivariate pattern analysis, and VPA, or multivoxel pattern analysis. Multivoxel pattern analysis. If you know a bit of statistics, one way to think about statistics is you have one item and you're doing your statistic on that item, or you can have many items that are correlated with one another, and you just analyze their correlation instead of analyzing each item one by one, right? So if you do the former, for example, you might do an ANOVA if you got behavioral measure. If you do the latter, you might do a MANOVA, and you're going to be analyzing the correlation between all the answers at the same time. And VPA is the same thing. except that your variable, instead of being an item, a question, is going to be the activation in a voxel, in the ball signal. So you're going to measure all the voxels at the same time and look for the correlations between all the voxels at the same time. And the pattern of activation throughout the brain elicited by a stimulus is often thought to be the representation of that stimulus. Right? So for example, you can have a whole scan of the brain, and you can look at all the voxels of the brain. The voxel is a measure, it's a volumetric unit. All the voxels of the brain, and you can look at the pattern of activation in the brain. And that has been used also to study representations, such as representation of three-dimensional physical objects, so representation, what we might call concept, for example, a concept of a table, a concept, where are they located in the brain, also faces, and so on and so forth. So HB mostly developed it at the beginning to study representations of faces, for example. Notice both use faces. In fact, a lot of overlap in the stimuli that I use. I'll come back to that in a minute. And that's still alive, even so that way of studying representations has been widely criticized, both in neuroscience and the philosophy of neuroscience, as being actually quite unclear whether it really gets at something we might want to call representation. So it's still widely used. More recently, maybe for about 10 years now, maybe a little bit more, following the work of a few people, including Krieger-Scotter, there's been a development of a new method, which is representational similarity analysis, which look at, you need to have a set of brain states, and you need to define a similarity measure over these brain states. And then a set of objects, and you have also a similarity measure defined over these objects. Could be, for example, faces, a set of faces, and you can say, oh, these two faces are more similar than those two faces. So you have a similarity measure defined over faces, a similarity measure defined over the brain states elicited by these faces. And you're going to say that the brain states are representation of the faces if you have a second order representation, if you can match the first similarity measure onto the second similarity measure to some interesting degree. Right? There's another way of thinking about where representations are located. It's widely used these days. It's got a lot of traction to study representation as well, and also to study other things. Okay, so methods have been developed in neuroscience over the last 20 years, and I've given you 3 examples, explicitly to find out where in the brain representations of various types of stimuli are located. Okay? It's not just method, it's also some research programs, and I will give you just 2 examples, and I'm sure if you knew neuroscience, you can find as many examples as you want. One which I've spent part of my life working on is the idea that conceptual representation can be reduced to perceptual representation, sort of a Humean idea, right? Or concept is just really an amalgamate of a perception of percepts. And people working in neuroscience work a lot on that, trying to show that when you're thinking about a table, you're really reenacting perceptual experiences of perceptual representations of table. To do that, of course, you need to use the concept of representation. Your conceptual representation of a table just is an amalgamate of perceptual representation. That's just one of the hundreds of thousands of papers on the topic. More recently, Josh Green of Trolley fame has moved toward another research program, which is the idea that we need to find out the language of thought in the brain. And it's been trying to provide neuroscientific evidence that representations are actually working like words, for example, like variables in the brain. And it's possible to find roles and fillers, which is basically thinking about predicates and proper names. And all of that also really assumes that brain states are very similar to a language, which means to say there are representations. So that's just 2 examples among many of possible research programs that are entirely based on the idea that brain states should be identified with representation. Okay, I hope I've convinced you that much of neuroscience relies on the notion of representation, both what neuroscientists explicitly say in their methods and in their research programs. Now, the problem here, of course, is that it's not quite clear what representation means, what the word representation means when it is used by neuroscientists. It's in fact quite opaque, and because it is unclear, there's a lot of puzzles that emerges. It's not quite clear what they are actually committed to when they are committing themselves to something that looks like neurorepresentationalism. It doesn't, what does it really mean to say that understanding the brain requires postulating representations if we don't really know what it means for a brain state to be a representation? So the commitment itself is not quite clear. More important, it's not quite clear what the methods, the three methods I've described to you, are really about. And it's not quite clear how to address divergences. So I've told you that these methods are used, for example, to study the same stimuli, to study representations of faces. But when you use them, you don't find the same brain states. If you use fMRI adaptation, if you use MVPN, if you use representation similarity analysis, you don't find the same neural correlate or the same representations. You use a vocabulary of faces. Now you want to know which of these methods get at representations. And to do that, you better know what a representation is, because if you don't know what a representation is, it's going to be hard to adjudicate disagreements between these different methods. And also, it's going to be hard to assess, to determine what criteria we should use to assess the various research programs I've mentioned, right? So if you want to assess whether the brain state have a linguistic structure, you will need to know what it means to identify a brain state that's a representation. And we don't have the proper criteria to do that until we have a good understanding of what is meant by representation. But we don't. And for non-accidental reason. So what I wanted to be doing, and what I want to be doing in this broader project, what I started to do, was to try to do a form of conceptual analysis, try to understand, okay, here's an interesting concept, it plays an important role in neuroscience. It's not quite clear what it means. A lot of things seem to be at stake to get a good understanding of this concept. But what does it mean? However, because I'm a naturalistic philosopher, I wanted to do it in a naturalistic manner. So I wanted to look at not just sit on my ass in my armchair and try to say, okay, what is a representation? Now, I want really to understand how neuroscientists themselves think about representations. That's also something I've been recommending in my past work. In case you haven't read this amazing book, it's still in print. I highly recommend it. It's a 2 minute of advertisement, but it's over. All right. But if you want to study a concept in a naturalistic manner, you have to address the following question. You have to address the following possibility. It's possible that neuroscientists, just like many of us, have many concepts expressed by the same word. So the word representation could, in principle, express different concepts. And one useful distinction is the distinction between what I call an effective concept and an explicit concept. The explicit concept is a concept that scientists are going to manipulate when they're explicitly thinking about the object, the extension of this concept. So you ask them, what is a representation? Could you write an essay for Syntax, dear Russ Poldrack? And Russ Poldrack is going to read a bit of philosophy to do his job, and he will do it well. He's a very smart person. But the concept that's going to be expressed there might not be, is a concept that he is manipulating in a context where he is intentionally theorizing about representation. And that concept might or might not be the concept that is deploying in a non-reflective context, right? So I think we should entertain the possibility that the explicit concept, the concept that's used or expressed in explicit concept, is different from the concept that scientists use in a non-reflective context when they do science on an everyday basis. There's tons of empirical evidence to suggest that this distinction actually carries empirical weight. So I've done some other work on the concept of innateness in biologists or psychologists. And in fact, biologists and psychologists are fairly sophisticated when they write about innateness, but when they use the concept of innateness, they're as unsophisticated as lay people. They're not, as soon as they get out of the reflective mode, they basically think about innateness as the man or the woman on the street does, and which is not extremely surprising. I think we all do that in every aspect of our life. We philosophers do that as well. But there's good reason to believe that often to understand how science works, the effective concept is what we want to be getting at, because the explicit concept might actually be quite marginal have a marginal impact in the practice of science. Anyway, that's so the idea was, okay, how do we get at the effective concept if it happens that it's not identical to the explicit concept? So here's two things you could do. None of them will work if your goal is getting at the effective concept. You could look at scientists' own theoretical efforts, look at what Podrak says in synthèse. That's not going to do what you want to do. You can also ask scientists, well, could you just tell me what you mean by innateness? Could you just tell me what you mean by field if you do physics? Could you just tell me what you mean by representation in neuroscience? And that's probably not going to be a very helpful strategy if you want to get at a concept that in practice, scientists happen to be using on an everyday basis in their lab. Better strategies are involved doing just corpus study or HPS, one might say. Large HPS, we could just look at the deployment of the concept in a very large corpora and see exactly how they use that concept. It's a totally fine project. What I've been interested in is put scientists in a situation where they will have to use a given concept and see how they use that concept. So we've done that for the concept of finiteness. And it's basically using what linguists call an elicitation study, which is a situation that's as realistic as possible. It's, of course, an experiment, so it comes with concerns about its ecological validity. But you put scientists in a context that's as realistic as possible, and then you ask them to deploy the concept. And hopefully, when they do that, they're less reflective than they would be otherwise. So that's what I've been doing. That's what I'm going to be describing to you next. All right, so what we've seen is that many neuroscientists are committed explicitly to mainstream representationalism, but also in their practices, in the methods they use, and in their research program, in their theoretical goals. We've also seen that it's not quite clear what they mean, and it's quite important to get at what they mean, among many other things, to adjudicate disagreements about neural representations. And I've described a methodology for doing just that. Cool. All right. Now, I want to present you with 4 studies where we actually do just that, me and with Pavela. So let me walk through these 4 experimental works. So we recruited 3 groups of people, neuroscientists, psychologists, and philosophers, by email and by advertisement on mailing lists. So we developed very, very long Excel sheet with like thousands of names. And then we sent an email asking participants to join us in our research project. Despite the fact that we literally sent more than 12,000 emails, we only got a small number of participants to get back to us, which is a little bit of a depressing fact, but such is life. I can tell you why that's partly it partly happened. So we only have about 200 neuroscientists or 150 psychologists and about 200 philosophers. They're mostly Americans. Most of them have a PhD. A few of them are graduate students. The results don't change if you just look at the people with a PhD. Very similar. So in that study, we started with a few demographic questions to just sort out neuroscientists or psychologists or philosophers from other people. Then they took part to 4 studies in a randomized order. Studies 1 to 3 were proper experiments where they were randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions, with one variable being manipulated. Study 4 wasn't an experiment in that sense. Then we asked them a few general questions about the foundations of neuroscience. And then they had an attention check to make sure that we're not dealing with bots and people also pushing the buttons, that kind of things. So we just eliminated those people, of course. Here's the way we analyzed. Everything was pre-registered. We extruded the data. We did a study-by-study analysis using ANOVA, so a little bit old-fashioned, but really the stats doesn't really matter which method you would be using. We set the alpha at 0.005 as yours truly has recommended in print. So try to commit myself to what I tell people should be doing, the least I can do. Then we did some post-hoc tests to look particularly for interactions, and then we just did a few explanatory analysis. All right. I told you earlier that neuroscientists are committed themselves to representationalism. We did ask the question not for the brain, but for cognition. Does cognition involve representation? And as you can see, nearly 90% of them just tell you yes. Right? So it's just an explicit commitment that if you want to do psychology, and I think the result would be the same if you want to do about the brain, you'd get neuroscience. Okay, study one. The vehicle of neural representation. So the question here is, let's suppose you believe there are representations. At which scale in the brain should they be found? Should we find representation at the level of small circuits, small network of neurons? Should we find representations at the level of areas? Should we find representation at the level of the whole brain? As it's obvious, even if you don't do any neuroscience, the brain has many different scales, and there's a question about at which scales are we supposed to find the brain? Do neuroscientists have any idea about that when they use the word representation? That's the goal of this study. So participants were randomly assigned to one of two conditions, the neuron condition and the population condition. The neuron condition presents, I will give you the stimulus, but the stimulus is set at the level of small networks of neurons, while the population condition is set at the level of large areas in the brain, different scales of aggregation in the brain. Here's the stimulus in the population condition. So pay attention for 2 minutes here in case you're falling asleep. These are the kind of stimulus that we're going to see again and again. So it's useful for you to get a handle on what we're doing. So each stimulus starts with a realistic short description, that's a summary of a study. Let me read it for you because there's some text on it. In a study, are we in practice session then?
No, we're not. This thing moved.
Okay, but you're sure we're not in practice session? You're sure it's not? Okay, good. Then doesn't really matter. Okay, in a study published about 10 years ago, participants were presented with stimuli in a standard block design with alternative images of faces and cars. Data were obtained from participants' fusiform area, somewhere here, the back of your brain, via blood oxygen level dependent imaging, that's fMRI for you, that's a Ball signal, with a functional, okay, that's an fMRI scanner with high spatial resolution. An example of the time series data obtained during the task is presented in figure C. Then they see figure A that describes the experiment. That's a sequence of images. The participant shows a cross for paying attention. Then shows the first stimulus, a face, a cross, a house, a face, a house. Okay. And then there's pictures of the data, activations in the FFA, the face fusiform area, and then the time series here. The Ball signal, positive reaction for a face, no reaction for a house, no reaction for a car, and so on and so forth. I should say, if you look at late 1990s and early 2000 neuroscience, this is very much that. There isn't a whole lot of difference between the kind of papers that Ken Wisher published in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and that. It's a very quick, very simple summary of the kind of work that was done. So it's actually quite a realistic stimulus. And then participants are asked 7 questions in random order. They ask a question about the neural population spiking carries information. That's one thing, they have to say yes, no on a scale. Whether it processes, whether it identifies faces, whether it's about faces, whether it responds to faces, whether it represents faces. Yeah.
Just to clarify, so is this a real study or is it one that you?
It's an invented study.
Okay.
It's close enough to the Ken Wisher 1997 paper, but it's invented. Yeah. Which you kind of see. Yeah. So, but yes, fair enough. Now, the 6 questions are divided into 3 groups. 3 of them are causal. They describe the reaction of the brain in purely causal terms. Processing, processing, responding to. It's purely causal vocabulary, one might think. 3 of them are intentional. Being about, representing, and identifying. One might think that to identify something is something that agents do. It requires recognizing someone as being something. They have an intentional content. And one of them is sort of in between carrying information. It's a bit unclear how carrying information is understood in neuroscience, more in a causal term or more in an intentional term. All right. That's the population condition. The neuron condition is very much the same study, except that instead of describing the tool, the measuring instrument, as being an fMRI machine, which look at very large area of the brain, of neural tissue, it's just electrodes that measures the activity of just a few neurons in the brain. So when if you get at the activation of a small network in the brain, at very different scale of organization in the brain. Right? But otherwise, as you can see, it's exactly the same study. Right? Participants are randomly assigned to one of these two conditions. One about the aggregation at the level of brain areas, large activation. One as the activation of networks of neurons. They're different scales. Cool. Let me walk with you with the results. It's a little bit overwhelming, but let me just tell you how it works. The rows are the disciplines, the neuroscientists, the philosophers, the psychologists. All right? The columns are the 6 different DVs that we are looking at: representing, carrying information, being about, responding, processing, identifying. All right? In red, this is people in the neuron condition. In green, this is participants in the population condition. FMRI, how is it called? Electrons. The scale is 1 to 7, 1 being totally acceptable. It's totally fine. Yes, you can say that the brain is responding, representing, carrying information about. 7 being, no, it's not totally fine. It's wrong. You should not be saying that. 4 is, I don't know. 4 is actually, I really don't know. Okay, there are 2 main things to notice in this study. It's a bit overwhelming, but if you do the stats, and even if you just eyeball it, you can see it. So the first thing is the DV cluster into 2 main kinds. Participants, when they are given, including neuroscientists, when they are given the causal DV, for example, being about, here, if you look at psychologists, responding, if you look at psychologists, totally okay. Yes, totally okay that the brain responds to a kind of stimulus. So causal vocabulary to describe the activity of the brain is perfectly acceptable. It's true for responding. It's also true for processing. It's below 4 here. By contrast, if you look at the intentional vocabulary, representing, being about, identifying, you get a 4 answer. This is here, and this is here, for the psychologists and the neuroscientists. Which means that neuroscientists, when we tell them whether it's acceptable to describe the reaction of the brain to stimuli in intentional terms, representing, being about, identifying, just say, I don't really know what I'm supposed to be saying. It's neither clearly yes, no, nor clearly no. It's actually, I'm not quite sure what to say there. The third finding is that the scale made no difference at all. People in the neuron condition, people in the population condition gave exactly the same answer, right? Which suggests that neuroscientists don't really have a good expectation about where in the brain, at what scale in the brain to find out the brain. Because if they had expectation that it's at the level of small network of neurons, they would have found that much more, this one much more acceptable than the other one. They don't. The option is a bit more, there's an interaction, but I'll skip the detail. There's an ambivalence. So here's the way I read that first thing. There's an ambivalence in the use of intentional concepts. Neuroscientists are not quite sure how to use this concept to describe, at least in this kind of situation, the reaction of the brain to stimuli. By contrast, when it comes to causal and information theoretic concepts, they're totally fine to deploy them. They have no issue. They're also non-committal about the scale at which the vehicles of representation, the physical substrate of representations, are to be found. And disciplines don't make much of a difference. Okay, that's the first study. The second study looks at the impact of specificity on the concept of representation. So there's again 2 conditions. One where the reaction of the brain has high sensitivity and high specificity. Specificity is what matters. So specificity, if something does not belong to a category, the signal should say, oh, it does not belong to that category. So few false negative, few false negative. By contrast, high sensitivity and low specificity, if something does not belong to the category, it happens that the brain says it belongs to the category. False positive is what I wanted to say. All right. So it's the same type of design that we've already seen. The high specificity, whenever there's a face, there's a signal. When it's a house of cards, so it does not belong to the face category, no signal. The low specificity for the house, you get a signal. So it's not just specific to the face, but you also get a signal for the house. Right? So the question is whether specificity here does matter for the assignment, for the use of the concept of representation. All right? So here we've moved from the scale of the vehicle to the properties of the causal relation between the stimulus and the neural states to qualify the neural state as being a representation. Okay, so that's the same type of data representation. The results are a bit more complicated, but first, we do confirm the distinction between the intentional vocabulary and the non-intentional vocabulary. People are somewhat uncertain about the intentional vocabulary, including representation, not uncertain at all about causal vocabulary, totally happy to use it. Now, when it comes to specificity, you're going to have an interaction. So specificity is going to be significant for the concept of representation for psychologists. When a state is not specific, they really don't want to say it's a representation. It does not, a state that's highly specific does not become a representation, but when it's not specific, it's not a representation. For neuroscientists, you find the same trend, but it didn't reach significance. I suppose if we had a much larger sample, it would have been significant. We find the same kind of trend. All right. So that's a true take-home message. Specificity matters overall. For the concept of representation, there's no evidence that it matters for neuroscientists. It might matter with a larger sample size, but we couldn't provide evidence for that. It does matter for psychologists. Right? So that's the second study. Now, so the first study was about the scale of the vehicle. The second study was about the causal relation between the stimulus and a neural state for the use of the concept of representation. The third study is about the use of a brain state in the broader brain. It's a broader brain, whether it has a function, whether it's used to do something further down in neural processing. It's the same type of experiment. I think you got the question. In one, you got the point. In one study, there's a mere correlation. In the other study, we describe the brain activation to be correlated to a stimulus, but also to have a causal role in the brain. Here's a mere correlation. You've already seen that slide. The correlation plus function, we tell them, oh, look, it's correlated to faces. But also, here's a network that this activation is part of. So it has downstream effect on the rest of the brain. It has a causal role in the broader functioning of the brain. Right? And the question was, when you do that, are neuroscientists more likely to say that it's a representation or not? Does it matter that we provide information about function for the way the activation of the brain, the activity of the brain is understood? And the answer is no. It just doesn't matter at all. It made no difference whatsoever. Again, we find the same result. Causal questions, totally fine. Not intentional questions. People are uncertain about what we want to say. Functional information is totally irrelevant for their use of the concept of representation and any other concept. You just ignore that entirely. All right. The last study we ran was about the notion of misrepresentation, mostly because philosophers think nothing can be a representation if it is not the case that it can be misapplied. So for a map to be a representation, it has to be able, at the very least, to misrepresent what it's representing. Right? A word, like the word dog, it's a representation because it can be applied to a cat, and so on and so forth. So that's part of the notion of representation. So many philosophers think that it can be misused, misapplied to what it's about. And so the question is that, what do neuroscientists, are they okay to say that the brain state is a misrepresentation? Very simple study. It's not an experiment. There's no random assignment in that case. It's more of a survey. So they've got a time series. They see a lot of face house, and then for number 5, it fires for a house. Not for all the houses, but for number 5, it fires. One might say it misfires. You might notice that number 5 has kind of a, I think this is, well, you don't see it here, but anyway, I think we wanted number 5 to have a house that looks very like a face, like a house, one might say. But in any case, one might think that, well, everywhere else it does not fire. It fires at 5. Maybe it's misrepresenting the house as a face. Is that something that neuroscientists are willing to say? The answer is no, not really. No, they just don't really know what to say. It's like puzzling. They're like totally, I don't know what to say. All right. It's not really thought to describe the brain as failing to do what it's supposed to do. It's just not part of the way they're addressing the brain. Which notice, if you think that they're really using the concept of representation in a very substantive manner, they should be willing to do that, according anyway to the way many philosophers think about representation. All right, this is part of the empirical project. Now I've got 20 minutes to tell you what it all means. Okay. the first thing I want to say is that this data suggests that the concept is unclear. What do I mean by an unclear concept? I promised you I would tell you what that means. Now, I'm going now to meet that commitment. A concept is unclear if the user of this concept do not know what follows from using that concept, so what inferences using the concept allow you to make, or what you must be assuming for you to be using that concept, right? So think about the concept as having an inferential role. When you have some premises, you can use that concept. When you use that concept, you can draw some conclusion. A concept is unclear if its inferential role is very, very thin. Not much follow from using that concept. And you don't really know what must be in place for you to say that something is a representation. Right? I think what we learned from the study we've been describing, particularly from studies 1 to 3, is that the concept of representation in neuroscience is unclear. Neuroscientists do not know at what scale to find the concept. They really have no expectations. So when you say something is a representation, it does not commit them to say, oh, it's going to be found at that scale of organization of the brain, rather than at this scale of organization of the brain. They don't really know whether they're not committed to the brain state having a function or a causal role. When you provide them information about a causal role, it does not make them more likely to say that it's a representation. So that's not part of the inferential role of the concept. And at least for neuroscientists, in contrast to psychologists, which have a more specific concept than neuroscientists, specificity does not seem to matter nearly as much as one would have expected. Again, so having a specific causal relation between the brain state and the stimulus is not part of the inferential role. So the question is, what is part of the inferential role of that concept for neuroscientists? Notice that scale for the vehicle, causal relations between the stimulus and the representation, and having a function are the three most obvious inferential aspects of the concept of representation. Right? It's hard to know what it means to be a representation if you don't have any commitment with respect to the scale of the vehicle, the causal relation with what it's about, and its functional role in the brain. Right? But neuroscientists don't seem to have any commitment for any of that. So the conclusion is that the concept is unclear, as I made it. The concept is also confused. What does it mean to say that the concept is confused? The concept is confused if it is about two different things that are distinct. So one might think, for example, that if you use a given concept to refer to table and chair, you have a confused concept. Right? You probably want to have two distinct concepts. Now, the fact that scientists are unwilling to say that a brain state can be a misrepresentation suggests that neuroscientists do not distinguish natural signs, such as, for example, the smoke is a natural sign of the fire. So the smoke cannot misrepresent the fire; it's just caused by the fire, and proper representation. So they fail to distinguish natural signs from genuine representation. So the concept of representation is obscured by this characterization of confusion of concept. All right. So the conclusion that I draw from these studies is that the concept of representation in neuroscience is both unclear and confused, which raises the question what to do with that concept. And I think you could do three things. You could try to understand why the concept is unclear and confused. You could try to reform the concept, like our good old friend Carnap. Okay, here's a concept that's confused. Let's explicate the concept and let's provide a regimentation of the concept. Very long tradition in philosophy doing just that. Or you could just eliminate the concept, and also our good friends, the church non. Okay, that's a terrible concept. Let's just do neuroscience without it. This is indeed what the church non, in fact, would be saying at this juncture. Should we reform it? I'm not very optimistic about this prospect, largely because it's not like philosophers haven't been trying to regiment the concept for decades. And neuroscientists don't seem to be caring for a minute about what it is we're doing. They're literally ignoring us. So I don't quite see much. There's little appetite, let's put it this way, among scientists to regiment this concept. So I think, that's a strike against the idea that the right thing to do for philosophers of science when they are dealing with an obscure and a confused concept is actually to reform it. We could eliminate it, and indeed, the church non, including their outstanding children who are neuroscientists are indeed recommending to do a non-representational neuroscience. And there's a small minor tradition in neuroscience that does that. But it's quite unclear for much of neuroscience what it would be really looking like. At this point, I'm not quite sure what the non-representational neuroscience would be really, what its shape would be. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think the proof is in the pudding, and we don't even have a baker. So, so what I want to be suggesting is that we need a fresh start, both as neuroscientists, but also more important as philosophers of neuroscience. And I think the fresh start, we need to find our cue in the work that Reinberger has been doing now when he worked on the concept of gene now years ago. And what Reinberger suggested is that when you find a concept that has unusual property for a philosopher, it's unclear, the right thing to do is try to understand why it's used in an imprecise manner. Try to understand why it's unclear. Try to understand why it's actually maybe confused. Is that I want to be suggesting. So Reinberger does exactly that and has one answer to that question, which can be summarized interfield pollination. So on his view, a concept happens to be unclear and confused, mostly when it moves between various areas of a discipline and allows information, experimental design, experimental tools, results, ideas, metaphors even to circulate across different parts of a given field. Now, that idea has been used extensively in recent philosophy of science, in recent history and philosophy of science, particularly philosophy of biology. So there's a lot of work that has been done on the idea that unclear concept actually work to pollinate across field. But the best case remains the concept of gene. That's the most worked out. In fact, that's the only one that has a very substantial scholarship on the vagueness, the lack of clarity, and the confusion of the concept, and why it will be functional. And I will just summarize here the Reinberger story and see whether we can extend it to neuroscience. That's one possible idea. So the Reinberger story is that the concept of gene is used in the many sub-disciplines of biology, from evolutionary biology to molecular biology to developmental biology, and so on and so forth. In each of these disciplines, the concept of gene is associated with intervention tools, measurement tools that are very precise at any specific time in history. Now, of course, they can change across time. But the methods for intervening and measuring give some content, one might say, to the concept. They operationalize them to some extent, and they give some concreteness to what it means that something is a gene. So if you go to a lab with a specific research tradition, whether it's discipline, and you call that a gene, people will know exactly what you really mean. It means you could intervene it this way, and you could have that kind of measurement to see whether your intervention has measure. But across disciplines, of course, the tools are not the same, the measurements are not the same, the intervention methods are not the same. There's great diversity across the subfield of biology. So when you abstract away from the concrete sub-area or sub-disciplines of biology, you end up with this great piece of information about what a gene is. A gene is a gene is a gene, because it's not connected to any specific. We got a gene professional here, so I'm waiting to be corrected a little bit later. But I'm telling you, blame Reinberger, that's not quite accurate. But anyway, the basic idea is that once you abstract from this concreteness of the intervention methods, the measurement tool, and so on and so forth, you get very little information. You get a concept that's unclear by my terminology. You don't know very much when you say across biological discipline that something is a gene. It actually carries very little information. Exactly, I've been arguing that you don't know very much when you say the brain state is a representation in neuroscience. Very much the same type of informational situation. Now, the interesting point in Reinberger is not just the observation that the concept is confused and sort of an historical explanation. It's also that it has a functional explanation. So he thinks that the lack of clarity of the concept, as well as its vagueness, is not as precise as I would want. But the lack of clarity and the vagueness is functional. It allows information of some kind to move back and forth between various areas of biology. So the idea is that if we had a precise concept, we would be nailing it down to one specific subdiscipline. And then talking in terms of gene would not allow the information to move, for example, from evolutionary biology to developmental biology. And that we know that is an extremely useful back and forth. So the vagueness and the lack of precision here happens to be functional. That's what I mean. That's what I call by interfield pollination. Right? So information moves between different fields and happens to by the vagueness, by the very point of the vagueness, allows ideas to be methods and results to pass from one to the other. Now, I think it's straightforward to use this, to apply these ideas to neuroscience. I think there's no doubt that the concept of representation does exactly that in neuroscience. Right? And here's just an example from contemporary neuroscience. In the book project, I will be looking at a bunch of historical cases, trying to see, in that episode of neuroscience between 1875 and 1900 or more recently, here's how the concept was used. But in contemporary neuroscience, you see the concept of representations being used to allow ideas to move from research in AI, mostly in deep neural network, to be applied to a visual perception. So, for example, the activations in the many layers of the contemporary DNA are called representations. So you might, and then you can measure the functional similarity of these neural representations in the artificial network and in the brain, so that whatever it is you learn in the artificial network can be extended as a hypothesis to understand what it is the brain does. Now, if you had a precise notion of representation with very specific commitment, you could not do that at all in terms of representation, because there is very little sense in which an activation in a neural network is a representation in the sense that whatever it is the brain does is a representation. The vagueness here of the term representation, just not knowing really what you mean when you say it's a representation, is really part and parcel to allow this kind of very loose similarity and the idea that we can still gain something by doing by making this comparison. So I think there's a lot of cases, but this is a nice one. All right. Now, but I think there's more to be said that beyond the kind of ideas that Reinberger had put forward, and that's where it gets totally speculative, and that's, I promise you some quite speculative ideas. That's the kind of things I've been thinking a little bit about, and I hope to be thinking more when I seriously work on the book. Now, here's a psychological model. As you can see, it's very sketchy. Let's suppose a psychological models of reading. And let's suppose kind of stuff that Coulthard has done over his quite illustrious career. And so you see a word, it's printed on a text, and you must say out loud this word. And for Coulthard, you've got two different ways to do that. But one of this way of doing that is called a sublexical route, where you first must recognize, have a representation of the specific letters that's written. Then you must recognize that letter as being a grapheme, meaning a letter type. There's many ways to write an A, but they're all A's. Then you must identify this grapheme to a phoneme. You must match this grapheme to a phoneme. Then you must combine the phoneme to have representation of the auditory representation of a word that gets sent to the motor system to have an utterance. Notice, is that the kind of story you have? You identify at each step of the processing, you are quantifying or postulating, one might say, representation. You have a representation of a specific letter written. You have a representation of a grapheme. You have a representation of a phoneme. And then you have a representation of the auditory form of the whole word that gets sent to speech systems. The psychological models, many of them, pretty much 90% of them, have that structure. That define our representation and transformation of our representation. This is what makes them psychological. The way to identify a state is to say it's a representation of a letter, of a grapheme, of a phoneme. Right? So they all have this representational nature. This is what makes them psychological models. Now, how do we map this psychological model onto what the brain is doing? After all, the brain is probably the substrate of what it is cognition. What cognition is about. One story is implementing. Because, fine, we have all these representations that we've been postulating to understand how reading aloud works from printed word. We know we must have a representation of that letter, a representation of a grapheme, a representation of a phoneme, and then a representation of the auditory form of the word. We have at least 4 representations where in the brain are they? And we could have a one-to-many or one-to-one in the best possible cases, but probably a one-to-many mapping. Now, notice there are actual objects in the world that work exactly this way, where you have a high-level description that involves often representations. And you can actually find one-to-one, but in fact, one-to-many, many mappings that are called computers. What a computer does is, in fact, implement some things that is at a high level, can be a representation of a number, for example, or a representation of anything in the world. And it can be mapped by one-to-many, it's a very complex mapping, obviously, onto the physical substrate of the brain. Now, it would be nice if the brain works this way. We could just have our psychological models and think, okay, we just need to look where in the brain these representations are located. It's very unlikely that this is the right story. There's a reason it works for computer. And there's a reason why many people have thought that computers were a good model for the brain, because then it gives you a research program, right? You just have the psychological models and you can just look where in the brain this representation are. You can go a top-down structure. It's very unlikely. It's unlikely because it's kind of hard to find any place that's not artifactual where you have an implementation. What you often find when you think about relation between models across scales, for example, is something that looks more like an approximation, or you can identify in idealized circumstances. So in some idealized circumstances, a model at a higher level can be identified to a model at a lower level, or the model at a higher level is an approximation of the model at a lower level, or vice versa, whatever the right relation. Okay? Rarely do you find anywhere in the world something that looks like implementation. You often find something that looks like approximation, correspondence in idealized situation, and so on and so forth. And I think because it's everywhere in the world, the right bet strikes me that the brain must also work this way. And if that's true, it's probably a wrong strategy to think that whatever state we call representation in psychology, our job is to find them in the brain. Right? It's not going to be the relation of implementation. What you want to know is how come that whatever it is that happens in the brain, described in its own terms, can be approximated by whatever it is that we've done when we've done our psychology. And so you want to have a story that is in terms of approximation. Now, in parts of the world, including part of the world I know very nothing about, but it's called physics. So again, now I've said things about the biologists to be corrected. Now I'm going to say things about physics to be corrected by those people here. It strikes me, from what I understand, that for at least many relations between scales, we do have a story to tell about how the models at the higher level scale is an approximation, is true in idealized circumstances, it's true at the limit, whatever it is, given what we know at the lower level scale. And there's mathematical relations that are actually quite precise, that allow us to tell us a story about relation between scales. So that's not a super committal, I think we're noting. Anyway, what's really remarkable in neuroscience is that, that we just don't know. We just have no idea about how anything that's happening, except for a few maybe really interesting cases. But usually we have very little idea about how our psychological stories that quantify over representation, that transform representation, that are actually predictive, that are actually explanatory maybe, at the very least predictive, how they can actually be approximation or true in idealized circumstances or a first pass. I'm not sure exactly what's the right relation. But we have no idea about how they relate to whatever it is that the brain is doing for most circumstances. So here's a proposal. Why do neuroscientists talk in terms of representation? They talk in terms of representation because it works as a promissory note. What they're doing is that they're looking at psychological models, which, as I told you, are essentially defined in terms of representation and transformation of representation. Being representational, so representational relation is a way to identify states in psychological models. And they use the concept of representation at lower level to describe what the brain is doing as a way to tell us, and there will be a story someday. Whatever it is we are doing now will allow us to tell you in the future how the psychological descriptions were approximate characterization, were a first pass, were maybe true in some idealized circumstances compared to what the brain is actually doing. So they're used in order to maintain some connection between neuropsychological and psychological models. Nothing more, nothing less. Of course, you could not do that. A good promissory note is one that remains very vague. If your promissory note comes with a lot of commitments about what it means to call a state of representation, then you're in trouble because you're betting about the future. If you just say it's a representation and somehow it's connected to what psychologists tell us is a representation of, let's say, a grapheme, but if you don't tell us what it means in a representation, you're not betting about the shape of the explanation, connecting the lower level models, the neuroscientific models, and the psychological model. So that's a way to tell us, I think, to tell the reader that there will be a story to be told at some point. but without, in a sense, mortgaging the future, letting the future open with respect to what this possible shape will be. Now, that's a hypothesis, a speculation, and it's one of the many ideas I want the book to be actually exploring in detail, to look at case studies where you can actually show that the concept of representation is introduced exactly for this kind of things and maybe get removed once we get a better understanding. Anyway, here's the conclusion. The current concept of representation in neuroscience is unclear and confused, but the usual philosophical attitude toward unclear and confused scientific concepts don't apply easily, right? We can't really reform. I think it's very risky at this point to eliminate. It doesn't seem to be the right strategy. A fresh start is needed, and the fresh start here is to do. I think what history and philosophy of science would do is try to understand how a concept works in historical and scientific concept, including to make sense of its confusion and lack of clarity. All right, the empirical work has been published in this paper in Frontiers with Louis Favela. Any good ideas come from him, any bad ideas come from me. And thank you for your attention. All right, let's take a 2-minute break, get some of you to leave, and yes.